Sit with me for a minute, because I'm going to tell you something today that took me 63 long years to fully understand, and I still remember the exact quiet afternoon it finally clicked into place. I was standing in my sister-in-law Peggy's kitchen in the summer of 1979, admiring her brand-new avocado green refrigerator, the kind everybody wanted that year. And she told me, almost proudly, that she'd traded in the perfectly good white one from 3 years earlier just because she was tired of looking at it. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a refrigerator. But 40 years later, when I finally sat down and added up every single thing Peggy had traded in simply because she was bored with it, the number on that page made my hands shake a little. It wasn't thousands of dollars, it was closer to 200,000. And once you understand exactly how that number gets built, one bored little upgrade at a time, you'll never look at your own closet, your own kitchen, or your own driveway the same way again. If stories like this one make you stop and think, hit that subscribe button right now, because I've got 60-some years of these lessons, and I'm only getting started. My name doesn't matter much for this story, but you can call me Dorothy, because that's what my own grandchildren call me, and I've been watching people spend money for longer than most of you have been alive. I was born in 1943, married in 1962, and I've had a front row seat to nearly 70 years of watching two very different kinds of people move through this world. The kind who keep something until it's genuinely finished being useful, and the kind who replace something the moment it stops feeling exciting. My sister-in-law, Peggy, was the second kind, and I loved her dearly for 41 years until she passed, but I watched her habit quietly cost her more than almost anything else in her entire life, and she never once realized it was happening while it was happening. Let me take you back to that kitchen for a minute now. Slow down with me, because it's really where this whole story genuinely starts for me. Peggy's old refrigerator, the white one she traded in, was 3 years. 3 years. It ran perfectly. It kept the milk cold and the vegetables crisp, exactly the way a refrigerator is supposed to. There was nothing wrong with it at all, except that Peggy had seen the new avocado green ones in a magazine, and suddenly her own kitchen felt old to her in a way it hadn't felt the week before she'd flipped through those pages. That's the part I want you to really sit with for a second, because it's the whole engine behind everything I'm about to tell you. Nothing about her refrigerator had actually changed, only her feelings about it had changed, and she spent real money to fix a feeling instead of a problem. Have you ever done that yourself? Looked at something perfectly good in your own house and suddenly felt embarrassed by it? Not because it stopped working, but because you saw something newer somewhere else? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I have a feeling more of you have done this than you'd like to admit, and there's no shame in it. I did it myself exactly twice in my life, and I'll tell you about both of those mistakes before we're through here today. Now, here's where I need you to understand something about the way Roy and I, that's my husband, God rest him, ran our household, because it's going to explain everything else in this story. Roy worked at a paper mill for 34 years, and I kept our books the entire time, every dollar written down in a ledger I still have tucked away in a drawer upstairs. We weren't wealthy people. We were ordinary, working people, and our income, most years, wasn't all that different from what Peggy and her husband Frank brought home. The difference between our two households wasn't how much came in, it was what happened to it once it arrived, and that difference, compounded across decades, is the entire secret behind that $200,000 number I mentioned a minute ago. Roy and I had one single rule about buying anything, and it wasn't complicated at all. Before we replaced something, we had to answer one honest question. Is this actually broken, or am I just tired of it? If the answer was that it still worked perfectly fine and we simply wanted something newer, we made ourselves wait a full year before buying anything at all. Most of the time, by the end of that year, the wanting had faded away entirely, the way most feelings do if you just give them enough room to pass on their own. But that rule only tells you half the story, because rules are easy to write down and considerably harder to actually keep, especially when everyone around you seems to be upgrading constantly and you start to feel like the odd one out. I want to walk you through exactly what this looked like across the decades, because watching it unfold slowly, the way I did, is the only way you really understand how enormous that final number actually becomes. Let's start with cars, because cars are where this habit does the most damage of almost anything I can think of. Frank and Peggy traded their car in nearly every 3 years for the entire span of their marriage, sometimes because something had genuinely started giving them trouble, but more often, if I'm being completely honest with you, simply because the new models coming out that year looked considerably nicer than what was already sitting in their own driveway. Roy and I, meanwhile, drove our cars until the mechanic himself told us it genuinely wasn't worth fixing anymore, which in practice meant we kept most of our cars somewhere between 9 and 12 years each. Now, I'm no mathematician, and I want to be honest with you that these are rough numbers built from my own memory and my own ledger rather than some official government study. But by my own calculations, trading a car in every 3 years instead of driving it closer to 11 or 12 years across a working adult lifetime of roughly 50 years means buying somewhere around 15 or 16 cars instead of 4 or 5. Even if each individual car cost about the same either way, that difference alone, just from cars, easily adds up to tens of thousands of dollars in additional purchases across a lifetime, money that in our own household went instead into savings, into our children's education, and eventually into a paid-off house that Peggy and Frank never quite managed to achieve themselves, even though their income was perfectly comparable to ours the entire time. Does that surprise you? It surprised me, too, the first time I actually sat down and worked it out properly. What's the longest you've ever kept a single car? I want to know in the comments, because I have a feeling some of you are going to make me look positively wasteful by comparison, and I genuinely love to hear it. But cars were only the beginning of Peggy's story, and if I stopped there, you might think this was really just about automobiles, which it isn't at all. It's about a much deeper habit that touched nearly everything Peggy ever owned.
Furniture worked the same way in Peggy's house. Every few years, whenever a new style came into fashion, out went the old couch, the old dining set, the old bedroom furniture, replaced with whatever looked current that particular season. I remember visiting her house in 1968 and admiring a lovely dining set she'd just brought home, only to visit again in 1974 and find it completely gone, replaced by something in a different wood entirely, because the old one, in her words, felt dated next to everyone else's houses she'd been visiting. Roy and I bought one dining set in 1963, the year after we married, and I'm sitting at that exact same table right now as I tell you this story, more than 60 years later. It's been refinished twice. One leg was replaced somewhere around 1991, but it's the same table, the same family history sitting underneath every meal we've ever eaten together in this house. I want to pause here and tell you about the first of my own 2 mistakes, because I promised you I would, and I don't want you thinking I'm sitting here pretending I never once fell into this same trap myself. In 1985, I saw a beautiful new sofa in a furniture store window downtown, considerably more elegant than the one we already had sitting in our own living room, which, if I'm honest, was still in perfectly good condition. I wanted that new sofa badly enough that I actually talked Roy into buying it, breaking our own year-long waiting rule for the first time in over 20 years of marriage. We kept that old sofa in the basement for storage, and I'll tell you plainly, within about 8 months, I genuinely couldn't remember what had felt so exciting about the new one in the first place. It looked like any other sofa to me by then, the newness having worn off considerably faster than I expected it to. That mistake cost us close to $400 in 1985, which doesn't sound like much today, but represented nearly 2 full weeks of Roy's wages at the mill that particular year. Has that ever happened to you? Bought something you were absolutely certain would make you happy, only to find the excitement faded within months, sometimes even weeks? I want you to tell me about it in the comments, because I promise you, you are not alone, and there's real relief in knowing how common this actually is.
Let's talk about kitchens for a moment, because kitchens might be where this habit shows up most visibly of anywhere in an entire house. Peggy replaced small appliances constantly throughout the decades I knew her. Toasters, blenders, coffee makers, whatever small gadget happened to be advertised as the latest innovation that particular year. Most of what she replaced still worked perfectly well. She simply wanted the newer version, the one with an extra setting or a sleeker shape, sitting on her counter instead of what she already owned. I've had the same stand mixer since 1970, a wedding gift from my own mother, and it still works exactly the way it did the very first day I unwrapped it, more than 55 years ago now. I've replaced one belt inside it, somewhere around 1998, and that's the entire repair history of a single appliance that's mixed literally thousands of meals across more than half a century. This is where I think the real damage of this particular habit hides from most people, because it never feels like very much money at any single moment. Nobody looks at a $40 toaster and thinks they're making a decision that will matter across their entire financial life. But Peggy replaced small kitchen appliances, by my own rough count from conversations we had across the years, somewhere close to every 18 months on average, decade after decade, while items in my own kitchen frequently lasted 20, 30, sometimes even 40 years before they genuinely needed replacing. When you actually multiply that difference out across an entire adult lifetime, appliance after appliance, decade after decade, it becomes a considerably larger number than almost anyone would guess just from looking at any single purchase on its own. Now, let's bring this a bit closer to today, because I know some of you watching this are considerably younger than I am, and you might be thinking that none of this old lady talk about refrigerators and dining sets really applies to your own life. I want you to think about your phone for a moment. I've watched my own grandchildren and great-grandchildren replace a perfectly functioning telephone every single year or two, not because it stopped working, but because a newer model came out with a slightly better camera or a slightly faster chip inside it. I don't pretend to understand all the technical details, I'll be honest with you about that, but I understand the pattern extremely well, because I watched an entire lifetime of it play out with Peggy's refrigerators and dining sets and kitchen gadgets long before phones ever existed in the form they exist in today. It's the exact same habit wearing a different, more modern outfit. Do you replace your phone every year? Or do you keep it until it genuinely stops doing what you need it to do? I'm genuinely curious what the honest answer is for most of you, so tell me in the comments, and don't feel embarrassed either way. I'm not here to make anybody feel bad about their choices. I'm just an old woman who's watched this pattern play out for a very long time, and I think it's worth talking about, honestly. There's one more area of Peggy's life I haven't told you about yet, and I think it might be the most surprising one of all, because it's the one that seems the most harmless on the surface. Clothing. Peggy loved fashion her whole life, and every single season, whenever the styles changed even slightly, out went whatever was hanging in her closet from the year before, replaced with whatever the department store windows downtown were showing that particular month. Most of what she gave away or threw out was still in perfectly wearable condition, barely worn in some cases, simply no longer matching whatever was considered current that season. I want to be fair to Peggy here because clothing is different from a refrigerator or a car in one important way. Styles genuinely do change, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to feel presentable and current in your own life. But the pattern Peggy fell into went considerably further than simply staying reasonably presentable. She was buying and discarding entire seasons of clothing, year after year, decade after decade, at a pace that, when Carol and I eventually tried to estimate it honestly, likely represented one of the single largest categories in that entire $200,000 figure I mentioned earlier, larger even than the cars, simply because it happened so frequently and felt so small and harmless in any individual moment. I bought considerably fewer pieces of clothing across my own lifetime, choosing instead to buy things that would genuinely last, mending a hem or a loose button, rather than replacing an entire garment the moment it showed the smallest sign of wear. I still have a wool coat from 1978 hanging in my own closet today, and I wore it again just this past winter, considerably older now than the woman who first bought it, but the coat itself hardly showing its age at all. What's the oldest piece of clothing you still wear regularly? I have a feeling a few of you might surprise me with your answers, and I'd genuinely love to hear about it down in the comments below. So let's get to that number I promised you at the very beginning of this story, the $200,000, because I know some of you have been waiting for it this whole time. After Peggy passed in 2020, her daughter, my niece Carol, and I spent an afternoon together going through old photographs and old memories, and somewhere in that conversation I mentioned this very pattern I've been describing to you today. Carol, who works with numbers professionally, got curious enough to actually sit down with me and rough out an estimate, based on what we could remember and piece together about Peggy's spending habits across roughly 55 years of adult life: cars, furniture, appliances, clothing, home decor, all of it added up and compared against what a household with similar income might have spent buying considerably less frequently. I want to be completely honest with you here, because I'd never forgive myself for misleading you. This isn't an official study. It isn't a guarantee of what upgrading habits cost every single person, and everyone's exact numbers will look different depending on their own choices, their own income, and their own particular habits. But by our own rough calculation that afternoon, adding up the difference between Peggy's constant upgrading and a more modest, need-based approach to replacing things, stretched across more than 5 decades of adult spending, the number we arrived at came out somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000, money that, in Peggy's case, simply never had the chance to sit quietly in a savings account, growing and compounding the way it did in ours. That number isn't really about Peggy specifically, and it certainly isn't about shaming anyone watching this video for buying things they enjoy. It's about understanding how a habit that feels almost invisible in any single moment, a new refrigerator here, a new sofa there, a new phone every year, quietly compounds into something enormous across an entire lifetime, simply because none of us ever sit down and add it all up the way Carol and I finally did that afternoon. I promised you I'd tell you about my second mistake, and I think this is the right moment for it, because it connects directly to everything I've just told you.
In 2003, I bought a brand new car, considerably nicer than anything Roy and I had ever owned, even though our previous car, only 6 years old at the time, was running perfectly well. I wanted it the way Peggy had always wanted things, not because I needed it, but because I'd simply grown tired of looking at the old one sitting in our driveway. Roy, God love him, didn't argue with me about it, though I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced it was a wise decision. Within 2 years, that excitement had faded exactly the same way the sofa's excitement had faded back in 1985, and I found myself, somewhat embarrassed, admitting to Roy one evening that I genuinely couldn't remember why I'd felt so strongly about needing that particular car in the first place. I tell you both of these stories, the sofa and the car, not to pretend I'm somehow above this habit myself, but because I think it's important for you to understand that this isn't really about willpower or discipline in the way people often assume. It's about recognizing the specific feeling that shows up right before one of these purchases, that particular restlessness that has nothing to do with something actually being broken, and simply pausing long enough to let that feeling pass before you act on it.
That's really the entire secret behind everything Roy and I built across our 61 years of marriage. And it's considerably simpler than most people expect it to be once you actually hear it stated plainly. We didn't earn dramatically more money than Peggy and Frank did across those same decades. We simply asked one honest question before nearly every purchase, and we gave ourselves permission to wait a full year whenever the answer to that question was uncertain. Is this actually broken, or am I just tired of looking at it? That single question, asked consistently across an entire lifetime, is worth considerably more than any single piece of financial advice I could ever give you, because it doesn't require a special education or a particular income level to actually use it. It only requires a willingness to notice your own feelings honestly, and enough patience to let the fleeting ones pass before you spend real money reacting to them. I still have that same dining table from 1963. I still have that same stand mixer from 1970. And I still have, tucked away in a drawer upstairs, a ledger full of decades of careful decisions that eventually added up to something Peggy, for all her warmth and generosity in every other part of her life, never quite managed to build for herself. A genuine sense of financial security that didn't depend on the next paycheck arriving exactly on time. I don't tell you any of this to make myself sound wise or superior, because I promise you, I made my own share of mistakes along the way, 2 of which I've shared with you honestly today. I tell you this because I loved Peggy dearly for 41 years, and I watched this particular habit quietly cost her something she never fully understood she was losing, right up until the very end of her life. I don't want that same thing happening to any of you, sitting here watching this video, wondering years from now where all your money actually went. I think about Peggy often, especially now that I'm considerably closer to the end of my own story than the beginning of it. She was a wonderful sister-in-law, generous with her time and her love in ways that had nothing to do with money at all. And I don't want anything I've said today to sound like I'm judging the life she chose to live. She enjoyed her new refrigerators and her new sofas and her new dining sets, genuinely enjoyed them, at least for those first few exciting months before the newness wore off each time. I simply think she never got the chance to sit down, the way Carol and I finally did, and see the whole pattern laid out clearly across an entire lifetime, decade stacked on top of decade, until the number became impossible to ignore.
So here's what I want you to do before you close this video today. I want you to think of one single thing sitting in your own house right now that you've been thinking about replacing, not because it's broken, but simply because you're tired of looking at it. Just one thing. And I want you to genuinely ask yourself that same question Roy and I asked each other for 61 years. Is this actually broken, or am I just bored with it? You don't have to promise me you won't buy the new one. I'm not here to tell anybody how to spend their own hard-earned money. I just want you to actually ask the question honestly, out loud if you have to, before you decide either way. Tell me in the comments what that one item is for you today, right now, sitting somewhere in your own house. I read every single comment on these videos, and I promise you I will be looking for your answer. And I might even write back to a few of you myself when I have the time to sit down with my tea and go through them properly. If this story meant something to you today, do an old woman a favor and hit that subscribe button, because I've got a lifetime of these stories still left to tell you, and I'd love for you to be here for every single one of them. And before you go, leave me a comment telling me the oldest thing you still own and use regularly, the thing everyone else might have replaced years ago, but you never did. I want to hear about it, and I have a feeling some of your answers are going to put my own 60-year-old dining table to shame. Thank you for sitting with an old woman and her stories today. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, take good care of the things you already have.